everyone. Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Sharon and Stoughton's annual meeting. My name is Jane Balawa. Hopefully tonight you'll be voting me in as next year's membership chair. We will also be voting in the rest of the board, as well as a slight increase to our membership dues because our contributions to national and state leagues have increased slightly. Just a slight reminder that members can vote tonight, please. Currently, our league chapter has 35 members, including 14 youth members. And this year we have either hosted or co-hosted 7 candidate forums, including the select board races in both of our towns, as well as our state representative election and our US Congress election. We've also hosted 4 educational events. We've had speakers on reproductive rights, ranked choice voting, forms of local town government, as well as an event on how a bill becomes a law featuring league member and our new state representative, Ted Phillips. Tonight, we will have a presentation by Ruth Zacharin, who's a Sharon resident, as well as executive director of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. Ruth has a particular interest in the intersection of domestic violence and guns, as well as increasing youth in the conversation about gun violence prevention. The coalition she directs has over 115 organizations, including the Massachusetts State League, youth, religious, and public health organizations. After tonight's presentation, Ruth will be happy to take audience questions, so please type them into the chat feature in Zoom, and one of our youth members, Anna Markman, will monitor the chat for your questions. Ruth, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me this evening. I'm really grateful to be with all of you and excited for the conversation. And because we're a small group, I'm really happy to be very casual about this and either take questions as we go or we can save questions for the end. But it's nice to have a smaller group because there's more opportunity for conversation. As was mentioned, my name is Ruth Zacharin, and I have been a Sharon resident for over 20 years now. My kids have gone through the Sharon Public Schools, and we're part of the legendary class of 2020. So our ties to Sharon are very deep, and it's always exciting for me to be in my own community talking about the work that I am so passionate about. So I welcome this opportunity. Prior to coming to the coalition, my work has always been in the field of domestic and sexual violence, and more recent years, human trafficking. When I first moved to Massachusetts, I worked at the Elizabeth Stone House, which is one of the first domestic violence programs in the country. But for many years, 11 years, I worked in the Brockton community, running community-based programs serving survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and co-facilitating the Greater Brockton Domestic and Sexual Violence Task Force. And working with survivors, particularly working with children in the aftermath of domestic violence homicides, which is a part of what my program did, really brought me in close proximity to the trauma of gun violence and the amount of harm that guns are causing in our society. And as a person who's done trauma response for my entire career, what brought me to the work of gun violence prevention was really about wanting to stop trauma and helping folks feel safer in their homes and in their communities and in this country. And that's the lens that I bring to this work. So that's just a little bit about me. It's exciting to also be with the league. We have someone very active in the league who's on our board, and I've learned a great deal from her. So if anyone here knows Jem Yuroff, she's a coalition hero and has been very involved in our evolution as a coalition. So what I would like to do with all of you this evening is divide my remarks into 3 parts, and I'll apologize in advance for various pets that will show up behind me on my screen. I cannot get through a single thing without a pet Zoom bombing, so they will be here at some point. What I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about the work of the coalition and what we do, just to set the stage for how we think about the work of gun violence prevention. And then I'd like to share with you a bit about how we think of the work of advocacy and what we think needs to happen in terms of policy change to really move the needle around gun violence. And this is something that Representative Phillips has heard me talk about. And soon when we all get to be in the State House together, I will be knocking on his door to have more conversations about this as well. And then I thought I'd end with something that I imagine is on everyone's mind, which is the increase in gun violence that we've been seeing over the past year and change. And what's happening and why is that happening? And what do we do about it? And the intersection of the pandemic and gun violence. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that because I think it's something that we're really all struggling with. And while I don't necessarily have a lot of answers or magic solutions, those of us in the work have really been thinking a lot about the why in terms of what we're seeing now. Why is it happening? And so I thought I would share some thoughts with all of you and engage in a conversation about that. So that will be our agenda for the evening. And I'll thank Anna in advance for helping us with any questions that come up in the chat. We'll handle this as a team and hopefully we'll be able to get to everyone's questions before the end of our evening. Excuse me, allergies are a thing. So let me start with a bit of background about the coalition, again, just to set the stage for how we think about and approach the work of gun violence prevention. And a lot of times when folks hear the words gun violence prevention, what they think about first is what we do to change laws to restrict access to guns and take guns off of our streets, which is certainly a big part of what gun violence prevention is, but it's not the sum total. And gun violence prevention really is about addressing the overall trauma of gun violence in our communities and thinking about what we can do to address root causes of violence so that it's not just about the gun as the instrument, but that we're really looking at prevention very holistically and really thinking about what we can do to make this country less violent overall and to help folks feel and be safer. We approach gun violence as a public health issue, one that is exacerbated by economic and racial disparity. And if we want to really address gun violence as a public health issue, we have to have a lens on all of those disparities and think about public health approaches to stopping the violence. So that's just a little bit of a background in terms of how we think about the meaning of gun violence prevention. A bit about what the coalition is and what we do. Our history is as follows. The coalition started in 2013 by a group of volunteers, including many folks from faith-based communities, who wanted to come together in the aftermath of the shooting at Sandy Hook and think about what needed to happen in Massachusetts in terms of our laws and our policies to prevent such a thing from happening here. And that initial group of people came together and started doing some research about gun legislation in the country as well as here in Massachusetts. And they were very instrumental in advocating for what's called the Gun Reform Law of 2014, which was a comprehensive set of reforms that address gun violence prevention in a number of different ways. And some of the things that we kind of take for granted that we have in place here in Massachusetts, such as universal background checks, are all a part of that 2014 law. And that has really helped to make Massachusetts, while we still have way too many shootings, Massachusetts does have the lowest rate of shootings in the country at this point. And part of that is because we have a good foundation of that kind of legislation. And once that law was passed, this group of volunteers went, great, we did a thing. We made a thing happen. We can go home and we can feel good about that. And of course, the violence continued and folks realized that a lot more work needed to happen. And people reconvened. And at the time, once the coalition reconvened, it became much bigger. People wanted to join and they wanted to get involved because as everyone was absorbing news of shootings out in the world, as well as in our communities, folks wanted to come together to do some work to make the story and the narrative about gun violence different. And when the coalition started to expand, we also realized that we had to approach gun violence in all its forms. Very often, and I think maybe less so now, but historically, when folks would hear about gun violence, they would think about mass shootings. And there's actually a lot to say about the definition of a mass shooting, and we can come back to that. The mass shootings actually end up accounting for a smaller number of overall deaths from gun violence. There are many other categories that fit into the definition of gun violence, one being domestic violence homicides. That's obviously an issue I care very deeply about. Gun violence that happens in the context of community-based violence, unintentional shootings, such as when a young person picks up a gun that's been unsecured and it's loaded and unintentionally shoots someone else. Firearm suicides, which are actually the highest number of overall deaths from guns, and police shootings. So when we talk about gun violence, it's not really a monolithic issue. It's all of those issues wrapped up into one. And so recognizing that, and as people started to join the coalition, the work expanded. And then the coalition was very involved in advocating for the 2018 Extreme Risk Protection Order law. If you're not familiar with ERPO, it gives family members and the police the ability to petition the court to have someone's guns temporarily removed if they're concerned about their risk of harming themselves or someone else. And then after the 2018 ERPO law was passed, there was some discussion around expanding our legislative work past just regulating the guns themselves. And more folks were joining, and the coalition got a grant to start hiring staff, which is when I was hired as the inaugural executive director. And we are now a mighty staff of 3. So it's myself, a community organizer, and a policy and communications specialist. And even though we're a small staff, having staff has really expanded our capacity and enabled us to do much more holistic work. Over the past 2 years that I've been with the coalition, we have done a great deal of expansion with new mission and vision statement, a new leadership team, which I'll talk about in a moment. We obtained our own 501c3 status. We've done a lot of work to really develop into our own nonprofit with a very clear vision of what we wanted to accomplish in the world. And what we have defined for ourselves is that we feel our work really falls into 4 different categories. The first being advocacy. So still doing a lot of work at the State House to advocate for bills and budget line items that we think will really get at root causes of violence and help keep our communities safer. We're also doing a great deal more advocacy with municipal leaders, mayors, city councilors, what have you. Just had a meeting with the mayor of Brockton last week. I'm doing some work in Springfield and Pittsfield and other communities, as well as Boston, which is where our office is based. So advocacy is a big part of what we do. The second area is in public awareness and education. We've been doing a lot of educational events to help folks in the Commonwealth understand gun violence, the nuances of gun violence, and to be really equipped to take action in order to reduce violence in our communities. We do a lot of partnering with other organizations to present those educational programs as well. Just recently, we partnered with Citizens for Juvenile Justice, which is a close collaborator of ours, to do a webinar on why young people pick up guns. And we work with the Center for Court Innovation. They are doing some research with young people around gun violence to present the findings of their research and also have a panel discussion around what that means for gun violence prevention in urban communities in Massachusetts. The third area is coalition building. Our goal is really to speak in unified voice, bring lots of folks together around this issue and work in coalition and community to make change. So we do a lot of things to bring together coalition members and also make sure that our member organizations, and we have 115 now from across the Commonwealth, as well as some of the national partners like Giffords and Everytown for Gun Safety, and Community Justice Action Fund are all part of the coalition as well. And we bring those folks together to really think about what can we all organize around so that more people are talking about these issues and we're building power that way. And another way that, and we show up for our member organizations, events, and try to amplify their work. And another area that we have really gotten stronger around is representational leadership. So about a year ago, we created a new leadership structure. I like to think of it as our bicameral system of government. We have a governance board as well as an advisory board that we call the Community Council, with a great deal of representation from our member orgs, particularly the Community Council, which is all folks from our member organizations who not just advise us, but really provide the overall leadership around what do we need to be advocating for, What should be the content of our messaging? Where can we be impactful? What should we feel the most urgency around because gun violence is such a huge issue? And it's really through their leadership that we determine how we work and what we focus on and what we're prioritizing. And the fourth area is community organizing. And to that end, we have hired a full-time community organizer who's focusing on communities most impacted by gun violence in order to really get a sense of what their collective will is, what their vision is for violence prevention and peace promotion, and make sure that that information, that will, that vision is making it to leaders and decision makers who can actually make some of those things come to pass. And our organizing work has really been influential over how we pick advocacy priorities as well, so that our work is really led and directed and grounded in communities most impacted by gun violence. So that's how we have kind of grown up from this first effort of a group of volunteers who wanted to change some laws in Massachusetts to really taking a more holistic approach to violence prevention. So I just want to pause there now that I've said that part before I get to the next part to see if there are any questions in the moment. Then I will continue on. And if you have questions as I'm speaking, please do put them in the chat because I know Anna is here to help with that process too. So with having this more representational leadership and with the community organizing that we have been doing, it has really had a profound impact in how we think about our advocacy work. And we went from really having one bill at a time that we were organizing around to now having a slate of 8 different legislative priorities, because we do believe that if we want to move the needle on violence prevention, if we want to make our communities safer, we have to approach this in many different ways. And so in conversations with our leadership and our member organizations and our allies, we made a decision that we were going to approach the work of advocacy with a couple of different lenses, as well as focusing on a couple of different issues. And one lens is certainly on racial equity and economic inequity, and making sure that we are addressing those issues as root causes of violence. Another being not wanting to augment the criminal justice system. Too often in the past with gun violence prevention, there have been some laws that have passed that have ended up increasing penalties and kind of treating gun violence as a crime issue as opposed to a public health issue. And that approach has ended up with more folks involved in the criminal justice system. And the communities that experience the highest rates of gun violence are also the communities most often that have been over-policed and disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system. And as we move forward with thinking about gun violence prevention, we want to make sure that we're not contributing to those factors. So with those being lenses, what we decided to do was to organize our advocacy work in 3 categories. And one being the guns themselves, because even though Massachusetts is strong around our legislation related to access to guns and regulation of guns, we can always do better. So looking at the guns as the instrument is one area. And we've been working in 2 particular parts of that, one being ghost guns. And we're actually doing that work more on the federal level. If you're not familiar with the term ghost guns, it refers to kits that you can buy through the internet that get delivered to your home, have 80% of the parts of the gun. You assemble it at home, but there's no serial number, which is why it's a ghost gun. It's not traceable. So that's clearly a very scary thing. We're understanding that more white supremacist groups are using ghost gun technology to access weapons, and we want to address that. But we're doing that work more on the federal level, and I can explain more about that. We have another bill that looks at the data that's collected from guns in the aftermath of a violent event to better analyze that data to understand where those guns are coming from. So that's our work right now around the guns themselves. The second category is about the trauma of gun violence, both the trauma caused by guns, as well as the ways that trauma can be a driving force of more violence. And to that end, we have really looked at what we can do to improve trauma response in the state, have more care around the trauma that too many people experience, and think about ways we can better care for that, knowing that, again, so much trauma is caused by guns, but it only just perpetuates more cycles of violence if we're not attending to that. So we have a couple of bills, including one with Representative Liz Miranda, that would expand trauma-informed care in the Commonwealth. And another bill, which is something that I feel really strongly about, would provide universal basic income to young people aging out of foster care. That is something I care deeply about because I've worked with so many of those young people and they've experienced a great deal of trauma. That's usually what brings them into foster care to begin with, is having some traumatic incident. The experience of being in foster care can lend itself to a lot of trauma. And then once they age out, they don't really have a strong foundation. And these young people don't do well in the world. And we know that that puts them at greater risk for violence. And another big push of ours has been an investment in youth as an investment in violence prevention. And if we're going to invest in youth, we need to invest in all youth, including those who struggle the most in the world. So that's been another area for us. The third area that we have really committed to is the intersection of criminal justice reform and violence prevention. And we actually see criminal justice reform as foundational to violence prevention for a number of reasons, including if the systems that are supposed to keep us safe don't work, or don't work for everyone, which means they don't work, then it's going to be really hard to prevent violence. Our work around criminal justice reform has focused mostly on juvenile justice reform, again, really getting at that investment in youth piece. We have 3 bills that we are sharing with Citizens for Juvenile Justice that we think will make a big difference in how we care for young people who have had involvement with the juvenile justice system in ways that will improve outcomes for them and help them successfully return to their communities. When we improve outcomes for those young people, by definition, that means there's less violence in the future. It reduces rates of recidivism, helps young people be successful in the world, and it just will make them safer as well as our communities safer. And another bill, which is a juvenile diversion bill, which means diverting young people away from the criminal justice system as much as we can and into services instead of incarceration. Because we know that once young people are involved with the criminal justice system, they struggle that much more in the world. Their outcomes are poorer. They have trauma in the context of their incarceration. So if we can keep young people out of that system altogether, it will also improve outcomes and keep them safer and our community safer. So we have really decided to approach the work of advocacy from those 3 different angles with a lens on racial and economic justice, making sure that we are working to change the way we think about public safety in the criminal justice system, and with a strong emphasis on the importance of investing in youth. So that's our advocacy platform. Any quick questions about that? So I see something in the chat from Janet. It's a yeah, sort of, not entirely. So the question is, if gun violence more prevalent among youth compared to older adults? The reason why I'm hesitating to answer that is because we're seeing gun violence being very prevalent amongst young people and younger to middle-aged adults. But when we think sort of long-term about what's going to help prevent violence in the long term, we really want to get at investing in youth and creating a strong foundation for young people, knowing that the more that we can do now to help them be safe and well in the world, that's ultimately what's going to prevent violence in the future. Because for me, violence prevention and prevention in general means addressing something before it becomes an issue. And the more that we can help young people be safe and well in the world now, we believe that that will improve their outcomes in the long run. So the last part that I wanted to bring to all of you, and then just we'll open up for whatever questions you have, is knowing that folks are really talking a lot about the rise in violence that we have been seeing over the past year to year and a half. And I don't know if folks got to see this, but President Biden released another plan just today or yesterday into today. I can't remember if I found out about it yesterday because of the work that I do, if it was released yesterday or today, but a multi-layered plan to address the rise in violence that we have been seeing in cities across the country. And in fact, here in Massachusetts, and even though we have relatively low rates of gun violence compared to other states, we have still seen 50% or more increase in shootings in cities across the Commonwealth, including Brockton, which is not too far away from here, which has been really alarming. And it's in stark contrast to other forms of crime, which have actually gone down, but shootings have gone up. And people have really been thinking about why that is and what needs to happen around it. There's a lot that can be said about this, but I want to touch on two main themes around the rise of gun violence that we have been seeing in recent months. And one is that right at the beginning of the pandemic, and this continued, we saw an incredible spike in gun sales and ammunition sales. It is always the case that when folks are feeling fearful, gun sales go up. Around presidential elections, gun sales go up. If there are major incidents in the world like 9/11, gun sales go up. There's a lot to be said around how the NRA and other groups have been successful at sending a narrative that guns make you safer. That's empirically not true. Guns in your home do not make you safer. But what has happened is there has become this connection between I feel unsafe, therefore I need to have access to guns. There's also a real nuanced conversation to that because we're seeing that gun sales are rising in all communities, including communities that hadn't historically been buying guns, because the sort of increased violence that we're seeing is making everyone feel nervous and unsafe. And so, for example, we have been seeing a rise in gun sales in the African-American community as a response to white supremacist violence. So like that's been a dynamic as well. But of course, when we add a lot more guns to our communities and our homes, by definition, you're going to see rates of gun violence go up just because there's so many more guns available. And we know that quick and easy availability of guns increases rates of firearm suicide. It also increases rates of community violence and domestic violence homicide as well. So that's been a huge concern. And there's nothing we can do to necessarily stop that or turn the tide on that. But we know that our communities are seeing this influx of guns. That's one piece. And the other piece that I really want to touch on is, as I mentioned at the beginning, understanding gun violence as a public health issue that is really driven by racial and economic inequity, and knowing that the pandemic has only exacerbated all of those inequities, it kind of creates a perfect storm of events for rates of violence to increase. The communities that have historically experienced the highest rates of gun violence, and there are many reasons why that has happened, but those are the communities that also had the most impact from the pandemic, both in terms of health impacts as well as economic impacts. And that's just further destabilized things for those communities. There's a study out of Northeastern University that looks at, what's the factor that's the biggest predictor of whether neighborhoods will or will not have high rates of gun violence. Many things came out of that study, but the one variable that was most closely associated with higher rates of urban gun violence was a low rate of social mobility and economic mobility. So in neighborhoods where folks don't have much opportunity for economic mobility, those are the neighborhoods where you would see higher rates of gun violence. And there's so many factors that have gone into creating that: redlining, lack of transportation, all sorts of things, but that has gone into creating those situations. So those communities have had a devastating impact from the pandemic. And with that, I think that's a big part of the reason we've been talking a lot about the intersection and the co-occurrence of the public health crises of COVID and gun violence, and seeing rising rates of violence in urban communities throughout the country. What's also been interesting about this conversation is how we talk about these issues and how we define them. So until recently, the accepted definition of a mass shooting was 4 or more people being killed by a single incident of gun violence. And we've actually really pushed back on that definition. And the reason being that that definition of mass shootings kind of ends up amplifying or really highlighting incidents at grocery stores, schools, public places, movie theaters, that kind of thing, which are traumatic and awful and upsetting, but actually are the smallest number of overall deaths from gun violence. When we shift the definition to 4 or more injuries from a single shooting incident instead of fatalities, what we find is that mass shootings are happening all the time and have been increasing, because there was this narrative at the beginning of as we started to open up from the pandemic, what folks were talking about is mass shootings are starting again because we're opening up from the pandemic. And as folks are going out into the world, mass shootings are ticking up again. That's actually not true. When we define a mass shooting as 4 or more injured by a single shooting, those incidents have been happening all along at increasing rates throughout the pandemic. They just don't get the same amount of attention or media response as a shooting at a supermarket. So if it's happening in the context of domestic violence or community-based violence and multiple people are injured, it's just not getting the same level of scrutiny or attention as what has happened in Atlanta or in Colorado in recent months. And again, those shootings are awful. I don't want to minimize them for a second, but we want to be careful about how we talk about these issues, because what we don't want to do is erase someone's trauma from the conversation. And those mass shootings that happen in the context of urban gun violence and domestic violence have been on the rise. And we need to talk about them. We need to figure out what we do with them. So that has all been at play in the conversation about gun violence during the pandemic. And the last part that I want to say around definitions, because I think it's really important, is the way that we think about these things also influences public policy. It influences where we put our energy. And definitions are really tricky. And I'll give you an example. Before the pandemic, shortly before the pandemic, there was a shooting that happened not too far away from here in Abington. And a man shot his wife and his kids, his 3 kids, and then himself. And so 5 people died as a result of that one shooting, which is assuredly a mass shooting, no matter which definition you use. But it was a domestic violence homicide. It was also firearm suicide. So it didn't get talked about as a mass shooting that happened in Massachusetts. So a lot of times when I'm out in the world and folks hear I do gun violence work in Massachusetts, and people will say, oh, it's great that you do this in Massachusetts because you don't have mass shootings in Massachusetts. That's not true. We do have mass shootings in Massachusetts. We just don't always define them as such or talk about them in a way that actually acknowledges the trauma and the impact of those shootings. But I can tell you we've been having mass shootings in Massachusetts all along with the pandemic, and an increasing rates of multiple folks being shot in one incident. And it is because there are so many factors at play, whether it's the increase in gun sales, whether it's the further destabilization of communities because of the pandemic. But we have a great deal of work to do to address those root issues and really get at what we can do to help individuals, to help communities, to help young people be safe and well in the world as a way of preventing more violence. So I know folks are concerned. I feel like every weekend is filled with news of multiple folks shot in different cities across the country, different communities across the country. We do have so much work to do, but gun violence is preventable. There are things that we can do to make this narrative different. We just have to build the collective will to make them happen here in Massachusetts, but also on a federal level. And that's been really hard to make happen. So hopefully, and I know that we're really struggling with getting some things passed on a federal level, but hopefully we'll be able to make some structural changes that will allow for some of this legislation to move forward. And then we can get the rest of the country having some of the foundational legislation around gun regulations that we hear here in Massachusetts. And the last piece that I want to say, because I think this is critically important, is the Biden administration is really working to make funding for community-based violence prevention more readily available through the infrastructure bill and now through the American Rescue Plan. And a big part of our advocacy at the coalition this summer is going to be compelling the state to use some of the American Rescue Plan dollars. I hope Representative Phillips is listening, to use American Rescue Plan dollars to support community-based and community-led initiatives that prevent violence and promote peace. Because an equitable recovery from the pandemic must include a focus on those communities and not just their economic recovery, but what they need to be safe and well in the world. And gun violence prevention is an essential part of that. So as we think about how we move forward and how do we prevent violence, there are already solutions happening in communities. There are activists who've been doing community-based work for a very long time, but have been struggling to do it because they don't have the resources to either build their program or reach as many individuals as possible. And in the past couple of years I've been doing this work, I've met so many activists who are self-funding programs and services because they see a need and they want to make it happen. That's a whole equity issue unto itself. But what we need to do is use some of these recovery funds to support that work, to support their vision for peaceful communities. And I think when we do that, and when we build that network of support that is community-based and community-led, we'll start to move the needle around gun violence. So I'm going to end here, and I would love it if folks wanted to ask some questions or have some more conversation. And I look forward to hearing what folks have to say.
I don't see any questions in the chat. I'm just gonna ask some that I have. What do you see as the root causes of gun violence?
Yeah, thank you for that. There are many, and some of them are, so, you know, and sort of starting from a lens of racial and economic inequity. When communities don't have the resources that they need to create safety nets, to have opportunity, like a lack of opportunity is a part of what causes violence too. Trauma is a root cause of violence. So we have all of those pieces that are at play in the communities most affected by the pandemic and by gun violence. And so a lack of opportunity, a lack of economic cohesion are all root causes of violence, and those are all driven by racial and economic disparity. But we also know, so I want to talk a little bit about the trauma piece, and I want to be careful when I talk about that, because there was this narrative that happened a couple of years ago that mental health is a cause of gun violence, and that is actually not the case. And there's a couple of things that I want to say about that. One is that every country in the world has folks who struggle with mental health. That is across the board. There's no country in the world where mental health issues do not exist. But gun violence is a uniquely American issue. Why? Because we have so much access to guns. And because I think, you know, there are other things that play as well. But gun violence we have rates of gun violence in the United States that totally eclipse other economically advantaged nations. So mental health is not itself a driving force of gun violence. But when folks have experienced trauma and that trauma doesn't get attended to, that can be something that exacerbates rates of violence. So when we talk about root causes, we want to get economic empowerment for communities, making sure trauma-informed services are in place, making sure young people have access to opportunity, that we're investing in young people, dismantling some of the forces that have created these situations like redlining and other practices like that. And also making sure that we reimagine public safety so that the systems that are supposed to keep people safe are working and doing so and not actually creating more harm.
Thank you. And someone asked, what are the roles of federal, state, and local government in these policies? Are you doing any work on federal gun control policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to answer in a couple of different ways. So one is, what states do really matters a lot, especially because the federal government's not taking a lot of action around gun violence. And, you know, again, we live in a state that has the lowest rate of overall deaths from guns in the country. And that's not just about our package of legislation, but our package of legislation definitely has an impact on that. So what we do in each state makes a great deal of difference. But what's really challenging is we know that of the guns that are used to commit violent acts in Massachusetts, probably only about 50% of them are guns that originate in Massachusetts. The other 50% are coming from other states that have weaker gun laws than we do. So we have a big problem with New Hampshire, with a lot of guns coming from New Hampshire and ending up in Massachusetts communities. So while our gun laws here in Massachusetts matter greatly, on a regional level, we have a lot of issues with guns coming from other states. Chicago, which has a high rate of gun violence, they looked at the data from the guns that they were recovering and found that so many of them were coming from Texas. So the lack of federal legislation has an impact on each state and how safe we are in each state. To that end, while our coalition really is focused on Massachusetts, we are starting to do some work on a federal level. Because, so for example, ghost guns, which I mentioned before, which are untraceable guns, because you can acquire them through the internet, regulating them here in Massachusetts doesn't really keep us safer around ghost guns. So our work around ghost guns has been on the federal level. The Biden administration has proposed a rules change that would classify ghost guns like other firearms, because they're currently not. And if we can get this rules change passed, it will make it much difficult, if not almost impossible, for the producers of these kits that I described before to distribute them to states. So we're going to be sending out a toolkit in July. We're working on this with our friends at Giffords to help folks submit public comment, because whenever there's a federal rules change, the public gets to comment on it. And I would like to enlist all of your help in submitting a public comment so we get as many people saying we need to have this rules change. Because if we can get the rules change enacted, it won't solve the ghost guns that are already in communities, but it'll cut off the source of more ghost guns. So we're starting to pick and choose what we feel we can be more effective with on a federal level versus what we're doing on a state level. But most of our work is on the state level. Did that answer your question, Janet? I'll assume that's a yes. Folks have any other questions?
I'll ask another.
Please.
Aside from changing laws, what else can be done to reduce gun violence?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on some of the advocacy we've been doing in different cities in the state around potential uses of the American Rescue Plan dollars, because the state's getting an allocation of that money, but each city gets its own allocation. And what's been really interesting about this advocacy work is that different cities are picking different things that they want to see happen with this money based on what they feel is going to be most meaningful for their community. So I'll give you two examples. In Brockton, the energy has been on outfitting one of the former school buildings to be a place where young people can safely go and have recreation, but also access to services. So creating a safe place for young people is something that the Brockton community, at this point, we're still sort of in discussion, but that seems to be the top choice for the Brockton community around how they're hoping to use some of these funds. And when young people, and we know this, you know, the data shows, particularly in the summer, which is when we also see higher rates of violence, when communities have more opportunity for young people to be engaged in employment, recreation, and education, rates of violence go down. So in addition to employment opportunities, we want to have that safe place for young people to go to. In Pittsfield, we're having a different conversation. And folks are thinking about the lack of housing. Housing is also a foundational issue to violence prevention. Folks need a safe place to live. And we also know that when people have experienced gun violence, it's not always safe for them to go back to wherever they were staying. So they need to get different safe housing. So what we've been talking about in Pittsfield is making more housing available for folks who have been impacted by violence. And all of those things are ways that we can prevent more violence, because the issue of gun violence intersects with so many other issues. I could go on and on, but those are just two examples of it. Any other questions or just conversation? Yes.
And Connie, I just was wondering what kind of success you've had in the Mass legislature since you mentioned the bill from 214. What kind of support are you getting from the legislature on passing it? And what is the prospect of passing any of your bills?
Yeah, so 2014 was the Comprehensive Gun Reform Law, 2018 was ERPO. When I first came on board with the coalition, the big focus was something called the Crime Gun Data Analysis Bill, which is still a priority for us, and I mentioned it before. And that actually was moving along quite nicely, and then the pandemic happened. So I actually feel fairly certain it would have been passed in the last legislative session had the world not rocked on its axis. So now we have a slate of a bunch of different bills, which I described to you before. We also do budget advocacy. So we also advocate for different line items in the budget that fund programs that prevent violence. That's a whole other piece of our advocacy work. And with the bills that we are focused on now, assuredly, we won't get all of them passed. It's just not the way the world works. But a part of what we want to do is really set the stage for helping folks, not just at the State House, but people in general, understand why these different components are so important to violence prevention. And I would invite Representative Phillips to jump into this part of the conversation, but a big part of what helps bills get passed is when you build broad support and you get a lot of folks energized about something and talking to their legislators and saying, this is something that I care about and I want to see happen. And as you build that support and you build that energy and you get a hearing where you have lots of folks come and talk about why a bill is so important, that's when you can make movement. So
I was just going to say, Ruth couldn't really have said it any better. I don't have too much to add to that, with the exception of the fact that, excuse me, the data collection bill is a great bill. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of that one. And I think, we're definitely, we're in hearing season right now. So I think as we come out of the pandemic and we get back to hopefully, being in person and being able to have some of these discussions about moving policy face to face with committee chairs and being able to express that support and the sort of the depth of that support in person, that's going to have a major impact. It's as Ruth referred to with some of the trauma bills that we talked about that Representative Miranda is filing. Those are still being drafted by House Counsel. And so as a result, I think we probably are taking a little bit of a longer view in terms of, I think that there's going to be a major education component about those bills. This session, you're probably looking maybe even next session for passage of those bills, as we, again, there's a certain amount of legwork and groundwork that needs to be done and laid in order to make successful policy. But again, the data bill, I think, is certainly ready for prime time and has broad support in the legislature. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we will be able to take action on that in short order as we get back to in-person sessions.
Thank you.
Of course.
Someone asks, at the hyper-local level that League of Women Voters Sharon Stone serves, what are some actions we could take? For example, should we ask that school-based health classes have a section on gun violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of hyper-local actions, part of it is just doing more educational events and having more conversations with folks about gun violence and the way that it intersects with other issues. And I say that because in suburban communities, with the exception of the mass shootings that we've been seeing on the news, a lot of times folks feel like community-based gun violence or even domestic violence homicides are something that happens in other communities. And a violence that happens anywhere impacts all of us. And so part of my personal goal anytime in having these conversations is to get folks energized to want to take action around gun violence that happens in any community. Because, I think about it this way, all the children are all of our children. And whether they live here in Sharon or in Roxbury and Mattapan or Springfield and Brockton, those are our children. And we can all be doing lots of things, whether it's the, federal rules change around ghost guns or advocating for the crime gun data analysis bill or what have you, that's going to keep all of our children safer. So, we can always act locally to really get at some of that stuff. But in terms of like the suggestion around health classes to talk about gun violence, the way that I think about it is we need to be having conversations in our schools, in our religious communities, in our civic organizations about the issue of gun violence. And sometimes it's about safe storage, acknowledging that there are gun owners in all communities, and we want to make sure guns are safely stored, because when they're not, they get stolen or unintentional shootings happen. So that can be a part of what you can do on a hyper-local basis. But I think a lot of folks are thinking about gun violence and worried about it. So, what can we all do to take meaningful action? What can we all do to create more peace in our society? And to really help folks understand gun violence is a public health issue. The root causes, things like the Extreme Risk Protection Order, things like firearm suicide, which happen in every community across the country, so that we're normalizing conversations about these issues are not taboo. We're normalizing conversations about trauma, they're not taboo. So when we get folks actually publicly speaking about these issues, we can actually come together and make more solutions. And then I think the other hyper-local thing that we can do is get more and more folks agitating for change on a federal level. And even though we have an extremely sympathetic federal delegation here in Massachusetts, we can be contacting our friends and neighbors in other states and get them to be putting pressure on their senators and representatives. We can be, taking action that way just to build a groundswell of support for making change. So those are just some ideas of what can be done in a hyper-local level. But usually what I like to do, the community organizer in me, is when folks are in community and want to do something, we kind of do a little bit of analysis of like, what's your sense of urgency? What do you want to work on? What feels meaningful? What's going on in your community? And tailor the suggestions based on that.
Do you think that school resource officers are necessary?
So this is a great question, and it's something that we have been doing some learning about with our friends at Citizens for Juvenile Justice. It's not an issue that we have taken an official position on, but it's something that we're very interested in. So I don't think of it in terms of necessary. I think of it in a couple of different ways. One is we have way too many schools here in the Commonwealth and across the country where there are way more police officers than counselors. And that has to change. So if we're putting our resources that are supposed to support students into a police response instead of a counseling response or supportive services response, that's a problem. I'm a licensed clinician by background. I've done trauma response my whole career prior to doing this work. I have been there many a time when police have responded to a mental health crisis. That's actually another policy change we're looking at. Police respond to crises or mental health crisis or an escalation of something very differently than a trained clinician would. So I'm a big advocate for more counselors and fewer police officers in schools. That's one piece. And the other piece is we also know that the presence of police officers doesn't actually equate more safety for all students, particularly students of color. And that's something that we really need to take a hard look at. And that we have disparities in terms of students of color getting referred to school resource officers, responded to by school resources officers at much higher rates than white students. And so there's a whole piece around racial disparity in school resource officers that we really need to address as well. But ultimately, and this is something that we're really thinking about at the coalition, is advocating for more counselors, more supportive services, less policing of students in school.
Why does the coalition advocate for raising the age at which a young person is viewed as an adult in the eyes of the criminal justice system?
That's a great point. I love Raise the Age. It's a great bill, and it's something that not everyone loves, but I love it. So Raise the Age is about moving 18, 19, and 20-year-olds who are involved with the criminal justice system out of the adult system and back into the juvenile justice system. And there are many reasons why we have gotten on board with this bill. One is that, and this is where data becomes really tricky, because data is tricky in the state of Massachusetts. A whole piece I could say about that, but I'll refrain. But we know that so many young people who are involved with the criminal justice system, it has something to do with firearms or violence or something like that. So assuming that many of these young people are involved with the system because of guns in some sort of way, we know that when young people are in the adult system, they don't get a lot of services, they don't get a lot of supports, they don't have a lot of contact with their family, and reentry when they go back to their community is not well supported. In the juvenile justice system, they get a lot more, including educational supports. And research has shown over and over again that when you put those services in place, when young people can have more contact with their families while they're incarcerated, outcomes improve. And what does that mean? Rates of recidivism go down. And if we know that young people are incarcerated because of something to do with firearms and rates of recidivism go down, by definition, you're preventing more gun violence. So we see that investment in youth, including investment in youth involved with the criminal justice system, as again, foundational to violence prevention. So it's something that I feel really passionate about. I'm also the mother of 19-year-old twins. And thankfully, my kids have never had involvement with the criminal justice system. But at the time I became aware of Raise the Age, my kids were 17, about to turn 18, and I kept on thinking, that day they turn 18 doesn't mean that they're really adults. It doesn't mean that everything in their life should shift in terms of how we treat them. And so I really thought about this as a mom too. And really thinking about, and actually there's a book written by someone who's now running for governor of Massachusetts, Danielle Allen. It's called Cuz. It's about the experience of having a cousin involved with the criminal justice system, and he eventually died because of gun violence. And she writes about the experience of that. And I happened to be reading that book as I first learned about Raise the Age. And I was reading about what happened to him at the age of 15 and 16 when he was in the criminal justice system. And I thought, there's nothing about what's happening to this young person that was going to help him be safer and more well in the world. So again, if we think about violence prevention, helping young people and all people be safe and well in the world, that experience he was having was not going to make that happen. So I'm a big proponent of making sure that all young people, no matter what their background or history, are getting the services and supports that they need.
What does it mean to view gun violence as a public health emergency?
You broke up a little bit. And what I think I heard was, what does it mean to view gun violence as a public health emergency? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay, great. So it's interesting because we just had a long conversation about this today. I'm so glad that the Biden administration is taking a multi-layered approach to gun violence, like major appreciation for that. But if you read the statement that came out of the White House, a lot of what is said is framed as a violent crime issue. And because of that, some of the resources that are being proposed to respond to the violent crime of gun violence is being put into policing. Policing is not prevention. Police get involved after something bad has already happened. What we want to do is prevent the violence from happening at all, so that you don't even need the police response because nothing violent has happened to begin with. So to think of it as a public health issue, as a prevention issue, is what do we need to do to create a healthier public? What do we need to do to create safer communities as opposed to respond to violent crime? I'll give you another concrete example, which is more of an analogy, but it helps me think about this. For the years that I work in Brockton, and we were working with a lot of kids who were affected by domestic violence, one of the things I'd say to our staff all the time is that part of our job was to change the narrative about these kids in their school setting. Because too often these kids struggled in the world because they experienced trauma, and it was easy for them to be labeled as bad kids. And I thought part of our job was to change that narrative that they're not bad kids, they're kids that bad things have happened to. And if you think about it this way, if the narrative is we need to manage these bad kids, you're going to have a set of policies and practices that flow from that narrative. If you think about it in terms of we need to manage that bad things are happening to kids, you're going to have a different set of policies and practices that flow from that. So when we think about gun violence as a crime issue, we're going to try to manage crime as a law enforcement issue. When we think about gun violence as a public health issue, we're going to try to manage the root causes of violence and to keep communities safer. And that response looks very different. Any other questions?
All right, thank you so much, Ruth and Anna. That was incredibly informative. Thank you again. I encourage everyone to check out the Mass Coalition Against Gun Violence Prevention's website. Ruth, do you want to fill that in quickly?
Yes. Just a caveat, we're about to launch a new website in the next month or so. So our website is under construction, but we'll have something brand new and shiny to show you soon.
Okay. And at this point, I would like to move on to the two votes that I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting. Joanne or Robin, do you want to run the votes? Or do you want me to run them?
Oh,
you can run them.
Yeah, you can run them, Jay.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know I was actually doing the vote part. Okay, our first vote is for next year's board. For co-president, we have Joanne Blatt and Robin Zoll. For treasurer, we have Ann Carney. Membership chair, we have myself, Jane Balawa. For communications chair, we have Sharon Fratkin, who unfortunately cannot be with us this evening. Is that it for the board? Okay, so all in favor, we're just going to do a voice vote because I don't imagine this being contentious. We always welcome new board members. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Anyone opposed, please say nay. All right, thank you. Our second vote is to increase our membership dues by $5 at each level. So I think that it's individual would go from 30 to 35.
No, we're only increasing individual.
Okay, sorry. So only increasing the individual membership.
Right, Anne? I just want to verify that. Anne?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry. Our individual membership dues would go from $30 to $35, and this is because at the current $30 level, we are actually losing money on individual members.
No, actually, it's not that. It's the $60 membership that's going up because we pay between, I think we pay $30 to the state and $32 to national, which comes to $62, which means we're losing $2 on every member. So that's why we're going to 65. The other memberships are staying the same.
Right. Okay. So our membership would be staying at 30, now 65 to 60, and staying at 90 for the family.
Right.
So we have to vote in all of them, right? Or just the change?
Just the change.
Okay, so we only have to vote in the increase from 60 to 65. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. All right, both motions pass. And finally, I would like to recommend that anyone who found tonight's meeting interesting to join us at future meetings, and you can join or renew your membership to the league, and then you'll get all the emails about all of our future events and meetings at our website, lwvss.org. And also posted on our website, you will find our annual report written by our co-presidents, but all the activities we've done this year. And maybe that might inspire you to get involved. And maybe there's a pet project that you're interested in running with the league, and we'd love to hear your ideas and have you at our next meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And Ruth and
Coming.